The vastness of space was filled with chaos. Stars glittered like scattered diamonds against the endless dark, but today they were witnesses to a horrific battle. The Sci-Fi Empire's massive fleet, known across the galaxy for its terrifying firepower, was under siege. Enemy ships, sleek and relentless, fired blinding lasers that tore through the massive starships of the Sci-Fi forces. Explosions erupted like fireworks in the dark, sending shockwaves that could be felt in the deepest corners of space. Amongst the chaos, there was one ship that stood out, the flagship of the Sci-Fi fleet. It was a sight to behold, a massive behemoth brimming with power and elegance. At its helm was Princess Leora, the sole heir to the Sci-Fi throne. Beautiful, intelligent, and brave, she had always been seen as the beacon of hope for her people. But in the midst of this battle, her future was far from secure. The Sci-Fi Empire had been betrayed. As the battle raged on, the fleet's systems began to fail one by one. Communications were cut off, weapons were disabled, and the ship's engines sputtered. The rebellion faction that had once been loyal to the Sci-Fi Empire had turned against them. A bomb had been planted in the core of the flagship, and just moments after the princess's escape pod was launched, the flagship was torn apart by a massive explosion. Leora's escape pod, a small vessel designed for quick exits, was jettisoned from the wreckage. But even in her last moments aboard the flagship, she knew something was wrong. Her trusted allies, the ones she had fought beside her entire life, had left her behind to die. The sabotage had been intentional, a brutal betrayal by those closest to her. The pod was damaged by the shockwave of the explosion. And now, with nothing but cold, unfeeling space around her, Princess Leora was alone. Her pod hurtled toward an unknown destination, Earth. The pod began its descent. At first, it was a peaceful freefall, like drifting in a dream. But the serenity didn't last long. The pod's warning systems blared loudly, snapping her from the numbness that had consumed her. The heat shields were failing, and the atmosphere of Earth was approaching too fast. Fire erupted around the pod as it plummeted through the skies. Inside, Leora struggled to keep herself conscious, clutching the harness in a futile attempt to steady herself. The air was thick, and the noise of the crashing pod drowned out all other sounds. Outside, the sky was a storm of swirling flames and smoke. She could see nothing but a fiery inferno as the pod crashed through clouds, plummeting like a stone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fought to maintain control, but her strength was waning. The last thing she saw before the crash was a glimpse of a vast green and blue world below, a world she had never seen before, but now it was her only hope of survival. Down on Earth, in a remote part of a military camp, Dr. Ethan West was finishing up his shift. As a battle-hardened medic, he had treated countless injuries from skirmishes between humans and alien invaders, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. He was packing his medical kit when a loud, thunderous crash reverberated through the ground. The ground shook violently, throwing him off balance. The sky above was suddenly filled with a blinding light, followed by a trail of smoke. He grabbed his kit, his instincts kicking in. Something massive had fallen, and it was not natural. Without hesitation, Ethan sprang into action. His team was quick to mobilize as well, knowing something dangerous had occurred. They rushed toward the crash site, their boots pounding against the earth. The smoke was thick, and the air was filled with the smell of burning metal and chemicals. As they neared the impact site, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There in the center of a crater lay the wreckage of a pod, an alien pod. The strange metallic surface, unlike anything he had ever seen, was twisted and charred from the fiery descent. As Ethan approached cautiously, he could make out the faintest outline of a figure inside the wreckage. Rushing forward, he carefully pried open the damaged pod with his medical tools. Inside, he found the princess, unconscious, bloodied, and bruised. Her breathing was shallow, and her pale blue skin shimmered faintly under the light. Her eyes were closed, but even in her damaged state, her beauty was undeniable. It was clear that she was not human. Yet something about her eyes stirred something within him, something he couldn't quite place. As Ethan worked quickly to assess her injuries, he realized the extent of the damage. Her wounds were severe, but not beyond saving. His mind raced. He had seen many injuries before, but this was different. Her species was not something he had encountered before. As his hands worked to stop the bleeding and stabilize her condition, he couldn't help but wonder who or what she was. What kind of creature could be so beautiful, yet so dangerous? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, chilling sound, a noise that seemed to echo in the stillness around them. Ethan froze, his eyes darting to the sky. For a brief moment, he thought he had imagined it, but then the noise came again, a faint whirring sound, like the hum of cloaking technology. A ship, large and sleek, appeared overhead, its metallic surface blending with the sky. It was invisible to the naked eye. Only the faint ripple in the air gave away its presence. Ethan's heart raced. This was no ordinary ship. The ship's scanners were already sweeping the area, likely searching for the princess. And worse, it was clear that these ships weren't alone. Ethan quickly grabbed the princess and pulled her behind a large boulder, his mind racing. He couldn't let them take her, not when she had barely survived. The sounds grew louder, and soon, several more ships cloaked above them, scanning every inch of the ground. Alien soldiers, with their advanced technology and weapons, would stop at nothing to find her. For a split second, Ethan wondered how he could have gotten into this situation. He was just a medic, not a soldier. Yet here he was, hiding with an alien princess, in the middle of a war he didn't fully understand. His hand trembled as he held onto the princess, his eyes darting across the sky. The alien ships were closing in, and he had no way of knowing how long they could remain hidden. With every passing moment, the danger grew. The searchlights of the ships flickered through the trees, their alien glow illuminating the landscape. Ethan knew the only chance they had was to move fast, to find somewhere to hide. His heart beat faster as the noise grew closer. He looked down at the princess, her beautiful face twisted in pain as she began to stir, her alien eyes blinking open. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice weak and hoarse. Ethan met her gaze, his pulse racing. "You're on Earth, and we need to get you out of here. They're coming." The princess looked confused for a moment before her eyes narrowed, recognizing the danger. You're human." Ethan nodded, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Yes, and I'm going to keep you safe." But as they hid in the shadows, the distant hum of the cloaked ships loomed ever closer. Ethan knew that their fight for survival was only just beginning. They were no longer just a medic and an alien princess. They were now unlikely allies, thrown together by fate, against the wrath of an empire that would stop at nothing to find her. The sound of footsteps grew louder. The chase had begun. Ethan had barely managed to drag the injured alien princess to safety. His heart raced, every muscle in his body aching as he pulled her toward the nearest shelter, his secluded base. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him. Her enemies were closing in, and time was running out. As he reached the safety of his makeshift camp, he quickly set her down on a cot, his mind racing to remember his medical training. This was unlike anything he had ever encountered, but he knew he couldn't afford to fail her now. Leora, the princess of the Sci-Fi Empire, was still unconscious, her breathing shallow. Her wounds were severe and blood stained the torn fabric of her alien uniform. Ethan worked quickly, tearing the fabric away from her body, to get a better look at the damage. Her ribs were cracked, and her skin was burned in several places. Her injuries weren't life-threatening yet, but they needed immediate care. As he cleaned the wounds and applied medical bandages, Ethan couldn't help but glance at her face. Despite the pain, she was still beautiful, even in this vulnerable state. Her pale blue skin shimmered under the dim light of the camp. It was clear that she was far from human, yet there was something about her that made him feel an undeniable connection. But even as he tended to her, Ethan was aware of the situation's gravity. His camp was isolated, but it wouldn't remain that way for long. The alien ships searching for her were sophisticated, their cloaking technology more advanced than anything humans had ever seen. Ethan wasn't sure how long they could remain hidden, but he had to try. For Lyora, it was only when he had finished treating her wounds that she began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, and with a gasp, she opened her eyes. At first, they were blank, disoriented, as if she didn't know where she was or who she was with. The moment her gaze settled on Ethan, suspicion flickered in her eyes. She tried to sit up, but the pain from her injuries forced her to gasp and collapse back onto the cot. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse. There was a coldness in her tone, a sharp edge that made it clear she didn't trust him. Ethan held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "You're safe. You're on Earth. I'm here to help you." Lyora's gaze narrowed, and she slowly scanned her surroundings. Her eyes were filled with suspicion, her hand instinctively reaching for the side of her body where a weapon might be. But then she stopped, seeming to remember that she had no weapon, that she was too weak to fight back. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much he should reveal. His first instinct was to tell her everything, to explain how her crash had been a fluke, how he had no idea why she was here or who had done this to her. But instead, he just sighed and spoke softly. "I'm Dr. Ethan West. I'm a medic. I don't know what happened to your ship or why you were attacked, but I couldn't just leave you out there to die. I don't expect you to trust me, but I'm trying to save your life." For a long moment, Lyora said nothing. Her alien eyes locked onto his, searching for any sign of deception. Ethan could feel the weight of her stare, but he didn't look away. Finally, she exhaled sharply, as if making a decision. "You're just a human," she muttered, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Why would you risk your life for me? I've been betrayed by my own people. I have nothing left." Ethan nodded, understanding her hesitation. Betrayal. He could see the pain in her eyes, the deep sense of loss. "I get it," he said quietly, "but I'm not like them. I don't know why they did what they did, but I'll help you get back on your feet. I'll protect you." For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in Lyora's eyes, something fragile, something human. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Ethan watched her carefully, waiting. He didn't press her for answers, allowing her to keep her secrets. He had learned, over the years, that trust was something that had to be earned, not forced. He continued to tend to her wounds, making sure she was comfortable, and quietly offering her water. As the hours passed, Lyora's defenses slowly began to crumble. The tension in her body eased, and she allowed herself to relax just a little. As the evening sun began to set outside the shelter, casting long shadows through the cracked windows, Lyora spoke again. "My people, my own allies, they turned against me," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "I trusted them. I thought they were my family. And then, when everything went wrong, they abandoned me, left me to die. I don't know why I'm even here. What do I do now?" Her words were heavy with grief, and for the first time, Ethan saw her for what she truly was, not just a princess, not just an alien, but someone who had lost everything. The Sci-Fi Empire, once her pride, was now nothing but a shattered dream. Ethan felt a deep sympathy for her, even if he didn't fully understand what it meant to be the heir to an empire. "You have me now," Ethan said simply. "I'll help you, Lyora. I don't know what the future holds, but I won't leave you." Lyora looked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond immediately, but the slightest hint of vulnerability flickered across her face. For a moment, there was a connection between them, an understanding, an unspoken bond that transcended their differences. But before Ethan could speak again, there was a faint, eerie hum in the air. Lyora's eyes widened, and she quickly turned to look at the sky. Ethan followed her gaze, his heart sinking as the sound grew louder. A ship, or several ships. Alien ships, no doubt. Your enemies, Ethan muttered, his voice tense. They're closing in. Leora nodded, a pained look crossing her face. They'll never stop. They want me dead. I can't let them find me. As panic began to rise in her eyes, she reached into a small compartment on her wrist and pulled out a small silver device. Ethan watched in awe as she pressed a button, and the world around them seemed to shimmer, vanishing into thin air. A cloak of invisibility settled over them, hiding them from the prying eyes of the alien ships above. Ethan's heart raced. This was unlike anything he had ever seen. The technology was far beyond human understanding, yet here it was, in his hands. He realized just how small his world was compared to Leora's, and just how much danger they were in. As the cloaking device activated, Leora's expression softened. She turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with both gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the device. "I don't know what I would have done without you." In that moment, Ethan knew that he had made the right choice. Despite the uncertainty, despite the danger, he had chosen to help this alien princess, and now he would stand by her, no matter what came next. But as the alien ships continued to search the area, Ethan knew that their fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. The tranquility of their temporary refuge was shattered in an instant. A high-pitched hum filled the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of approaching ships. Ethan's heart raced as the cloaking device flickered for a moment, almost as if it sensed the danger drawing near. The alien ships, sleek and deadly, had found them. The Sci-Fi Empire's forces had zeroed in on Leora's last known coordinates. Ethan's mind raced. They had no time to waste. The camp wasn't built to withstand an assault like this, and the cloaking device, while effective, wouldn't hide them forever. They needed to move, and fast. Leora, standing beside him, was already alert, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to leave," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Now." Ethan nodded quickly, pulling his pack tighter over his shoulder. He grabbed Leora's hand, helping her to her feet. She was still weak from her injuries, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She had survived betrayal, a deadly crash, and now she was about to fight for her life. The sounds of the alien ships grew louder as they began their descent toward the base. Ethan's pulse quickened, and he glanced around, looking for anything they could use. His gaze fell on the small assortment of tools and makeshift weapons scattered around their shelter. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He reached for a few items, then turned back to Leora, who was already pulling a strange, alien-looking gun from the side of her suit. "You're going to need to teach me how to use that," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. Leora gave him a brief, calculating look. "You've never used one of these before, have you?" Ethan shook his head. "No, but I've used weapons before. I can learn quickly." With a swift nod, Leora handed him the gun. She moved quickly, showing him how to load it, how to set the energy levels, and how to activate the firing mechanism. The weapon was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen, sleek, lightweight, with a design that seemed to hum with power. But he was a soldier at heart, and despite the technology gap, he had no intention of backing down now. Before they could finish their preparations, the first wave of alien soldiers appeared at the edge of their camp. They were tall, imposing figures, clad in black exoskeletons that shimmered in the light. Their eyes glowed with a cold, unnatural light. They were here for one thing: to capture or kill Leora. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the soldiers moved forward, weapons raised. Without hesitation, Leora activated her cloaking device, making them vanish from sight. Ethan's breath caught as he felt the world around them blur, the camp disappearing into the background. But the enemy wasn't fooled for long. They began scanning the area with advanced technology, moving cautiously and methodically. Ethan's pulse quickened as he saw them draw closer. They were closing in on their position, and they knew something was wrong. Ethan held his breath, waiting for the right moment. When the soldiers were just a few meters away, Leora whispered into his ear, "On my mark. Get ready." She didn't have to say it twice. Ethan's fingers tightened around the alien weapon, his body tensed in anticipation. Leora activated her device, making the two of them visible again. The moment the soldiers saw them, they reacted quickly, guns aimed, weapons ready. "Now," Leora shouted. The air erupted into chaos. Ethan fired first, the gun's energy beam blasting through the air with a sharp hiss. The alien soldiers reacted instantly, their own weapons firing in return. The battlefield became a blur of flashing lights, explosive energy blasts, and the screech of alien technology. Ethan was outgunned, outmatched, but he fought with every ounce of his being. He ducked behind a rock as an energy bolt zipped past his head. His heart raced, but his mind was clear. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for Leora, for her future, for everything she had lost. This wasn't just about him anymore. Leora was beside him, firing her own weapon with deadly accuracy. She was a blur of motion, her movements quick and precise. She moved with the grace of someone who had spent years training in combat, and she was a force to be reckoned with. But even she couldn't take on the entire enemy force alone. They were outnumbered and outgunned. "Ethan, the cloaking device. Use it," Leora shouted, ducking behind cover as a blast from an enemy weapon hit the ground near them. Ethan's heart raced as he realized what she meant. He quickly activated the cloaking device, and they disappeared from view once again. But it wouldn't last long. The alien soldiers were smart. They'd be searching for them. He glanced at Leora, who was breathing heavily, her face flushed with effort. "We need a plan," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Leora's eyes flickered with determination. "We'll take them down, one by one. We don't need to fight them all, just the ones that get too close." Ethan nodded. He understood the strategy. They had the advantage of stealth, and they would use it to their fullest. The first soldier that appeared around the corner was met with a blast from Ethan's gun, dropping him in an instant. Another soldier followed, but Leora's weapon made short work of him, sending him sprawling to the ground. The battle raged on, with the two of them moving swiftly, using the environment to their advantage. It was a dangerous dance, stealth, speed, and precision. But Ethan wasn't going to let them die here. He had made a promise to Leora, and he intended to keep it. But then, just as they thought they were gaining the upper hand, the enemy brought out something even more dangerous, a massive robot, towering over them, its guns aimed directly at their position. It was heavily armored, its body covered in thick, impenetrable plating. The sheer size of it made it a terrifying opponent. Leora's eyes widened as she saw it approaching. "This won't be easy," she said grimly. Ethan took a deep breath, pushing his fear aside. He knew they had to defeat this robot to survive. But how? They had no heavy weaponry, no explosives. They were outgunned, outmatched. But that wasn't going to stop them. Leora glanced at him and nodded. "We'll have to outsmart it." They waited until the robot was close enough, and then Leora activated the cloaking device once more, making them vanish just as the robot's sensors swept the area. As it neared their position, Ethan and Leora sprang into action. They darted behind the robot, avoiding its detection. Ethan climbed up its massive leg, using the rocky terrain as cover. When he reached the top, he planted an energy pulse into a weak spot at the base of its head. The robot staggered, its systems failing. With a final, deafening crash, it collapsed, sending a shockwave through the area. The soldiers around it faltered, momentarily stunned by the loss of their heavy hitter. Ethan and Leora exchanged a brief look of triumph, but they knew it wasn't over. The battle was far from won. They had fought fiercely, but the enemy was relentless. They would have to keep moving, keep fighting if they had any hope of survival. The underdog theme had never felt so real. Ethan, a mere human, had faced down one of the most advanced alien forces in the galaxy and lived to tell the tale. But the real battle had only just begun. With Leora by his side, he knew they could take on whatever came next. The fight for survival wasn't over, but with courage, determination, and a willingness to fight back, Ethan and Leora would keep pushing forward, no matter what. The sound of gunfire still echoed in the distance as Ethan and Leora made their way deeper into the woods, their steps quick and urgent. They had fought hard to survive the last attack, but neither of them felt safe. The air was thick with tension, and the once quiet refuge they'd built felt more like a trap now. Ethan glanced over at Leora. Her face, usually a mask of stoic determination, now bore the weight of sorrow. She had been betrayed by her own people, her empire, and now the only ones left to rely on were humans. Ethan, a medic with no battle experience, and his few surviving allies. How much longer could they keep running? How much longer could they fight? As if in answer to his unspoken question, the ground suddenly shook beneath them. A rumble reverberated through the trees, followed by the unmistakable whine of engines, the sound of ships descending from the sky. "We have to move." Now, Leora's voice was urgent, her eyes scanning the sky. She grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him toward a safer location, but before they could get far, a series of blinding flashes lit up the sky. The enemy ships had found them again. But this time, it wasn't just the Sci-Fi forces. Something was different. The ships descending from the sky were not the same ones they had fought off earlier. The markings on them were unfamiliar, dark and jagged. These ships belonged to another faction entirely. Ethan's heart sank as a figure emerged from one of the ships, a tall, armored figure with glowing red eyes and a cruel, almost sadistic grin, stood at the top of a ramp that extended from the ship. This wasn't just another alien soldier, it was the general of the rebellion faction. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place in Ethan's mind. The rebellion, the group that had helped Leora escape from her people, had been working with the Sci-Fi Empire all along. They had never been allies. They had been pawns in a much larger game. And now they were paying the price. "What's happening, Ethan?" Leora's voice was sharp with disbelief as she watched the general approach, the realization hitting her like a punch to the gut. "Why are they here?" Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. This was all a lie. The rebellion. They weren't on our side. They were working for the Sci-Fi Empire. "We've been used." The alien general stepped forward, his voice booming across the battlefield. "Leora, daughter of the Sci-Fi Empire, you thought you could escape, but you were never meant to. You're coming with me." Leora's face hardened, but inside, she could feel a cold wave of dread wash over her. This wasn't just another fight. This wasn't just another enemy to defeat. This was the culmination of everything she had tried to escape, a betrayal that cut deeper than anything else. She had trusted these people, these rebels, and they had used her to further their own agenda. "Not today," Leora whispered under her breath, but the bitterness in her voice didn't reach her heart. Her heart was already heavy, burdened with the weight of this new betrayal. They were out of time, out of options, and all Ethan could do was hold his ground. As the general advanced, Leora readied herself to fight. She activated her cloaking device once more, disappearing from view. The rest of the battle was a blur. Shots were fired. Explosions rocked the ground, and Ethan did his best to keep up with the chaos, using the alien weapons Leora had taught him to survive. But the situation was deteriorating fast. The general was no ordinary enemy. He was ruthless, efficient, and merciless. His soldiers were everywhere, flanking them from all sides. It was no longer a fight. They were being hunted. Then, the worst happened. In the midst of the chaos, as the sound of battle filled the air, Ethan heard the familiar voice of his closest ally, Bonner, calling out from behind a barricade. "Ethan, over here." Bonner's voice was strained, his breath ragged, but the urgency was clear. Ethan didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the sound of Bonner's voice, his heart in his throat. Bonner had been with him through every battle, every loss. He was one of the few people Ethan trusted completely. She didn't have to say it twice. Ethan's fingers tightened around the alien weapon, his body tensed in anticipation. Lyora activated her device, making the two of them visible again. The moment the soldiers saw them, they reacted quickly, guns aimed, weapons ready. Now, Lyora shouted. The air erupted into chaos. Ethan fired first, the gun's energy beam blasting through the air with a sharp hiss. The alien soldiers reacted instantly, their own weapons firing in return. The battlefield became a blur of flashing lights, explosive energy blasts, and the screech of alien technology. Ethan was outgunned, outmatched, but he fought with every ounce of his being. He ducked behind a rock as an energy bolt zipped past his head. His heart raced, but his mind was clear. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for Lyora, for her future, for everything she had lost. This wasn't just about him anymore. Lyora was beside him, firing her own weapon with deadly accuracy. She was a blur of motion, her movements quick and precise. She moved with the grace of someone who had spent years training in combat, and she was a force to be reckoned with. But even she couldn't take on the entire enemy force alone. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Ethan, the cloaking device. Use it. Lyora shouted, ducking behind cover as a blast from an enemy weapon hit the ground near them. Ethan's heart raced as he realized what she meant. He quickly activated the cloaking device, and they disappeared from view once again. But it wouldn't last long. The alien soldiers were smart. They'd be searching for them. He glanced at Lyora, who was breathing heavily, her face flushed with effort. "We need a plan," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Lyora's eyes flickered with determination. "We'll take them down, one by one. We don't need to fight them all, just the ones that get too close." Ethan nodded. He understood the strategy. They had the advantage of stealth, and they would use it to their fullest. The first soldier that appeared around the corner was met with a blast from Ethan's gun, dropping him in an instant. Another soldier followed, but Lyora's weapon made short work of him, sending him sprawling to the ground. The battle raged on, with the two of them moving swiftly, using the environment to their advantage. It was a dangerous dance, stealth, speed, and precision. But Ethan wasn't going to let them die here. He had made a promise to Lyora, and he intended to keep it. But then, just as they thought they were gaining the upper hand, the enemy brought out something even more dangerous, a massive robot, towering over them, its guns aimed directly at their position. It was heavily armored, its body covered in thick, impenetrable plating. The sheer size of it made it a terrifying opponent. Lyora's eyes widened as she saw it approaching. "This won't be easy," she said grimly. Ethan took a deep breath, pushing his fear aside. He knew they had to defeat this robot to survive. But how? They had no heavy weaponry, no explosives. They were outgunned, outmatched. But that wasn't going to stop them. Lyora glanced at him and nodded. "We'll have to outsmart it." They waited until the robot was close enough, and then Lyora activated the cloaking device once more, making them vanish just as the robot's sensors swept the area. As it neared their position, Ethan and Lyora sprang into action. They darted behind the robot, avoiding its detection. Ethan climbed up its massive leg, using the rocky terrain as cover. When he reached the top, he planted an energy pulse into a weak spot at the base of its head. The robot staggered, its systems failing. With a final, deafening crash, it collapsed, sending a shockwave through the area. The soldiers around it faltered, momentarily stunned by the loss of their heavy hitter. Ethan and Lyora exchanged a brief look of triumph, but they knew it wasn't over. The battle was far from won. They had fought fiercely, but the enemy was relentless. They would have to keep moving, keep fighting if they had any hope of survival. The underdog theme had never felt so real. Ethan, a mere human, had faced down one of the most advanced alien forces in the galaxy and lived to tell the tale. But the real battle had only just begun. With Leora by his side, he knew they could take on whatever came next. As he rounded the corner, he saw Bonner crouched behind a pile of rubble, his rifle raised as he scanned the area. But before Ethan could reach him, the ground exploded beneath them. The shockwave sent Ethan sprawling, his ears ringing as the world spun around him. He scrambled to his feet, panic rising in his chest. "Bonner," he shouted, his voice cracking as he searched the rubble. But there was no answer. There was no movement. His heart sank as he reached the spot where Bonner had been, his hands trembling as he sifted through the debris. His worst fears were confirmed when he pulled Bonner's lifeless body from beneath the wreckage. A large chunk of metal had pierced Bonner's chest, and the blood stained the earth beneath them. Tears burned at the corners of Ethan's eyes, but he pushed them back. This wasn't the time. Bonner's death had to mean something. He couldn't let it be in vain. He stood, the weight of the loss sinking in as he turned to Leora, who was now visible once again, standing at the edge of the battlefield, her eyes wide with horror at what had just happened. "Bonner's dead," Ethan said, his voice raw. "He's gone. We can't win this alone." Leora's face softened, her heart aching for Ethan. She had lost everything: her empire, her family, her people, and now he had lost a brother. It wasn't just the physical wounds that hurt, but the emotional toll. Both of them were fighting for a cause they weren't even sure they believed in anymore. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Leora said quietly. "I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to bring this kind of pain to your world. You've lost so much." Ethan's gaze softened as he met her eyes. "You didn't do this. We're both in this together. I'm not going to let them take you, Leora. I promise." But deep down, Ethan wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this promise. His heart felt heavy with doubt, and the reality of the war they were fighting was closing in on him. The alien general stepped forward, his voice cutting through the battlefield. "Enough of this. Surrender, Leora, or your human friends will suffer." Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. The betrayal they had suffered was a hard pill to swallow, but the fire in his chest, the need to protect Leora and honor Bonner's sacrifice, was stronger than ever. "No surrender," Ethan growled under his breath. "We fight." But this wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about survival, about keeping their hope alive, even when everything seemed lost. Leora stood beside him, her resolve hardening. "We'll survive this, Ethan. We will." And with that promise, they faced the oncoming storm together, knowing that the battle for their survival had only just begun. The enemy may have won today, but they wouldn't win forever. Not as long as they still had each other. Ethan and Leora stood side by side, staring out into the void of space. Their plan had been set into motion. It was no longer a matter of survival. No, now it was about taking the fight to the enemy, striking back before the Sci-Fi Empire could retaliate. The stakes were higher than ever. With Bonner gone, and the weight of their losses pressing down on them, there was no room for failure. This mission would either make them or break them, and they both knew that their odds were slim. Leora's alien technology hummed softly beside them. The cloaking device, a gift she had given Ethan, now powered their stealth approach as they neared the enemy stronghold, hidden deep within the heart of the Sci-Fi Empire's territory. The space station loomed ahead, a massive structure of steel and energy, guarded by fleets of warships and armed forces. Every corner was fortified, every inch of the station covered by security systems. But Ethan, being human, had always relied on his creativity to overcome the odds, and that's exactly what he was going to do. "We can do this," Leora whispered, her eyes set with resolve. "We have to." Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening as they moved closer to the heart of enemy territory. This mission wasn't just about defeating the Sci-Fi Empire. It was about avenging all the lives lost, all the sacrifices made. It was about fighting for a future where Leora, and by extension humanity, could stand free of alien oppression. But more than that, it was about showing the galaxy that Earth was not to be underestimated. The station's massive silhouette seemed to swallow them whole as they approached, cloaked and undetected. Ethan, despite the technology at his disposal, couldn't ignore the looming sense of dread that accompanied each step. The stakes had escalated beyond anything he had ever imagined. They were no longer just up against alien invaders. Now, they were about to face the full might of an empire that had controlled the galaxy for centuries. They slipped through the defenses undetected, utilizing the cloaking technology Leora had taught him to perfection. The station's security systems scanned the area, but they saw nothing. For now, they were ghosts, silent and invisible. But as they ventured deeper into the heart of the station, they could feel the tension building, the knowledge that their cover wouldn't last forever. Their time was running out. Suddenly, an alarm blared throughout the station. The cloak flickered, and Ethan cursed under his breath. They had been discovered. The enemy was aware of their presence. As the sounds of approaching soldiers echoed through the hallways, Ethan motioned for Leora to move faster. It was time to fight. The two of them were a blur of motion, moving through the narrow corridors with the precision of soldiers who had been in far too many battles. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins as they encountered enemy forces. The sound of blaster fire rang out, and they fought with every ounce of strength they had. Ethan used everything at his disposal: alien weapons, makeshift explosives, even the environment itself, to take down the soldiers that came at them. Leora was a force to be reckoned with, her agility and combat skills unmatched as she cut through the enemy ranks with deadly precision. But even with their combined strength, they were outnumbered. The station's defenders were relentless, and no matter how hard they fought, there were always more soldiers. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. There was no room for mistakes. Every step they took, every corner they turned, was a risk. Finally, they'd reached their objective, the control room, where the alien general awaited them. The doors slid open with a hiss, and there he stood, tall, imposing, and brimming with confidence. The general's armor was a dark, gleaming black, covered in jagged patterns that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy. His red eyes gleamed as he looked at them, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You've made it this far," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But this is where it ends, Leora. And you, human, you should never have been involved in this war. You are nothing." Ethan gritted his teeth, his hands clenched around his weapon. And for a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the general's words. The alien general was right in one regard. Ethan was just a human. He didn't have the advanced technology, the centuries of power, or the resources the Sci-Fi Empire had. But he had something the general would never understand: determination. The will to fight, to stand against impossible odds, to protect what mattered. The final confrontation began with a flurry of movement. Leora's blade slashed through the air, and Ethan's shots rang out, striking the general's forces. The battle was intense. Laser beams ricocheted off the walls, explosions rocked the room, and the air crackled with energy. But the general was no ordinary foe. His movements were swift, and his strikes were precise. With every blow, he seemed to get closer to victory. Ethan's heart raced as the fight wore on. His body ached from the exertion, his vision blurred from the strain. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. The general's soldiers closed in, forcing them into a corner. But Ethan refused to back down. He would die before he let the general take Leora. He had already lost so much. He wasn't about to lose her too. With a cry of determination, Ethan threw himself at the general, using all the strength he could muster. He knocked the general's weapon aside, just long enough for Leora to land a devastating blow to his side. The general stumbled, a gurgling sound escaping his mouth as he fell to his knees. But the victory was short-lived. As Ethan turned to Leora, he saw the pain in her eyes. The general's blade had struck her, and blood stained the ground where she stood. He rushed to her side, his heart sinking in his chest. Lyora's breath came in ragged gasps, her body weakening as the wound took its toll. "No, Lyora, stay with me," Ethan shouted, his voice breaking. But even as he spoke, he knew it was too late. The damage had been done. Lyora smiled faintly, her eyes locking with his. "Ethan, we did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We stopped them. You were the hero I never thought I'd find." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes as he held her, the weight of their battle crashing down on him. This was it. This was the cost of their fight. And as Lyora's hand slipped from his grasp, he felt the finality of it all. The station around them shook, and the sounds of explosions filled the air. But it was over. The battle had been won, but at a price. Ethan had given everything for this moment. And so had Lyora. As the final remnants of the station began to crumble, Ethan made one last promise to her, his voice a whisper in the chaos. "I'll make sure they know what you did. I'll make sure they know you were more than just a princess. You were a warrior, a hero." And with that, Ethan stood, alone, amidst the wreckage, as the stars above seemed to watch in silence. The final stand was over. The hero had sacrificed everything. But in the end, it had been worth it. For humanity, for Lyora, and for the hope that someday the galaxy would be free. The explosion that tore through the heart of the Sci-Fi Empire's stronghold was deafening. Ethan had given everything he had, every ounce of strength, every bit of courage, and it had led to this moment. The base was collapsing, the walls crumbling around them as the devastating shockwave spread. He had sacrificed himself to ensure Lyora's safety, knowing the consequences but still choosing to make the ultimate sacrifice. He had only one goal left: to protect her and ensure that humanity would not be forgotten. His mission was complete, but the cost was far greater than he could have ever imagined. Ethan lay there, barely conscious, his body torn apart by the blast. His chest heaved with shallow breaths as he struggled to keep his eyes open. The pain was overwhelming, but through it all, he could hear her voice, a soft whisper in the chaos. Lyora was kneeling beside him, her hands pressed against the wounds on his body, her face a mask of determination and sadness. "Ethan, hold on," Lyora whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, hold on." Ethan's vision blurred, but he could still see the urgency in her eyes. The alien technology she had used to save them both had allowed her to heal many injuries in the past. But this was too much. The life force that had once seemed so powerful was now stretched thin, unable to fully heal him in time. "Lyora," Ethan whispered, his voice weak. "You don't have to do this for me." Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head. "I won't let you die, Ethan. You've done more than anyone could have ever asked. You saved me, you saved humanity. And I won't let that go in vain." With a soft, steadying breath, Lyora activated the healing device she carried. The technology hummed with a low, resonant sound, but even as the advanced equipment began to work its magic on his wounds, it became clear that time was against them. Her healing abilities, though extraordinary, were limited. The damage was too severe, and the energy it required to fix Ethan's injuries was greater than she had anticipated. Ethan could feel the coldness of space surrounding them, the air growing thin as the minutes passed. The battle had ended, but the cost was beyond what he had imagined. "It's okay," he managed to say, his voice weak and raspy. "I did what I had to do, to protect you and Earth." Lyora's eyes filled with sorrow as she leaned closer, her forehead touching his. "You're a hero, Ethan. And I promise you this, humanity will never be alone. As long as I live, I will ensure that your people have a place in the galaxy. Your fight has not been in vain." The words were soft, yet they were a promise that Ethan could feel deep in his heart. Despite the pain, despite the darkness closing in, a small smile tugged at his lips. He had done it. He had protected her. He had protected Earth. The galaxy would now see humanity for what it was: strong, resilient, and capable of standing up to even the mightiest of foes. But as Leora's tears fell onto his face, a sense of calm washed over him. He knew that he had done everything he could. He had fought not just for survival, but for the future. For a future where humanity wouldn't be looked down upon, but instead respected. A future where Earth would stand side by side with other civilizations, no longer a forgotten, insignificant world. But even as the darkness threatened to take him, there was something else in the air: hope. A glimmer of light that shone through the pain, through the loss, and through the destruction. Humanity had proven its worth, and Leora would ensure that their legacy would live on. The pain in Ethan's chest subsided as he began to fade. His eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment, everything was still. The world around him, the crumbling station, the faint hum of the alien technology, everything seemed to blur. But there was one thing that stayed with him: Leora's face, her promise, and the knowledge that he had made a difference. The next time Ethan opened his eyes, it was not to the chaos of war or the destruction of battle. He found himself back on Earth, standing in the heart of a new world, a world that had been changed forever. Leora, now fully healed, stood beside him. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue, and the stars above seemed to twinkle in a way they never had before. It was a world of hope, of new beginnings. Leora had kept her promise. Humanity was no longer alone. The next few months passed in a blur of diplomatic meetings, intergalactic talks, and building alliances. Leora, once a princess with no place in the galaxy, had become a leader, one who had united species from across the stars. Her efforts had forged a new intergalactic alliance, with Earth as a key player. No longer were they just a small, insignificant planet. They were now a part of something much greater, a force to be reckoned with in the galaxy. And as the new intergalactic council was formed, Ethan's name was spoken with reverence. He was the human who had stood against the odds, who had fought for what was right, and who had made the ultimate sacrifice. His actions had paved the way for humanity's new future, a future where they could stand side by side with civilizations that once thought them weak. But Ethan, though hailed as a hero, knew that things would never be the same. He had seen the depths of sacrifice, the price of war, and the cost of standing against an empire that was so much more powerful than they were. The world and the universe had changed, and so had he. It was the last time he would ever be the same. There were no grand celebrations, no accolades that could erase the weight of what he had done. He had given everything to protect those he loved, to protect humanity, and to ensure that the galaxy would never forget the strength of Earth. As Leora stood beside him on a balcony overlooking the Earth, she looked up at the stars, her thoughts far away. She had kept her promise, and now it was time to turn the page on a new chapter. The fight was over, but the road ahead was just beginning. New alliances, new challenges, and new hopes for the future were on the horizon. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination, "the universe will know that Earth is not a place to be ignored anymore. We've shown them what we're capable of." Ethan smiled, though his heart felt heavy. There was so much work to be done. The future wasn't going to be easy, and battles would come again. But humanity had proven it could stand tall. They had fought, they had won, and they had earned their place in the galaxy. The scars of war would heal with time, and Earth would no longer be seen as a vulnerable, forgotten planet. Together, they would forge a new path, one filled with hope, peace, and the promise of a future where humanity stood strong, side by side with the most powerful beings in the universe. And as they looked up at the stars, the final image that remained was not of destruction, but of hope. For in that moment, humanity had finally earned its place in the vast expanse of space, and the journey was just beginning.